My golden child cousin borrowed $17,000 from me to start a business, but actually spent the money traveling and gambling. I took him to court over it, but my whole family sided with him. My cousin recently came to me asking me to lend him $7,000 for a business investment. He already owed me $3,000, so at first I said no, but my parents forcefully pressured me into giving in. My cousin promised to have it back to me within 6 months as he'd have his business up and running by then. However, the 6 months passed, and not only had he not even started his business yet, but he had actually spent the $7,000 on himself. He went traveling in Asia, bought a new gaming console, and gambled the rest away. I remember the day he came to me about it, his parents and mine with him. Apparently, he felt awful for how reckless he was with the $7,000 and wants to make things right. In order to do this, he asked for another loan of $7,000, swearing that this time he'd start a business. I straight up laughed at him, but as I was in the middle of telling him no, my aunt interrupted me. She screamed that family help each other out and started relentlessly pushing me into giving him the money. The memories of being ganged up on like this resurfaced, and as my parents, my aunt and uncle, and my brother all towered over me talking about lending him the money, I essentially let them bully me into giving my brother another $7,000. As the months went on, my brother Darren, of course, never paid me back. I gave him another 6 months, and after that, I started pressing him about the now total $17,000 he owed me. Of course, my family defended him, saying I was overreacting and needed to give him time. This was unfortunately no surprise, as growing up the difference between Darren and me was obvious. I remember being 16 and working long hours at a diner to save for my first car. I took every extra shift I could, while Darren didn't have to work at all. On his 16th birthday, our family threw him a big party and gave him a brand new car with a huge red bow on top. It wasn't just the car that bothered me, it was how the family treated him. They acted like Darren deserved the world, while no one seemed to notice how hard I worked. When I finally saved enough to buy a used car, there was no celebration. It felt like my effort didn't matter. One Thanksgiving, Darren casually mentioned crashing his car while racing with friends. Instead of being upset, my family laughed and brushed it off. My uncle even wrote him a check to cover the repairs. If that had been me, I'd have been grounded for months. It was always like that. When Darren struggled in school, they hired tutors and blamed the teachers. When I had trouble, I was told to figure it out on my own. Darren got everything handed to him, while I had to work for everything I had. The family saw him as special, while I was just expected to manage on my own. My mom told me to be patient. Darren has always come through for the family, and he'll come through for me too. Sure, Darren had helped family members before. He'd paid off my aunt's overdue credit card bill once, and even covered my cousin's rent when she lost her job. Everyone loved to remind me of that as if those small favors made him some sort of hero. But what they conveniently forgot was that Darren never had to worry about his own bills. My uncle had always handled his car payments, and my aunt paid his credit card debt when it got too high. His college tuition, fully covered. He never had the stress of budgeting, of choosing between paying the electric bill or the rent. Of course, he could come through when he didn't have real responsibilities weighing him down. Darren would swoop in and throw a few $100s at someone now and then, but no one had ever given him anything like the $17,000 total I'd loaned him. That was a whole different story. He was always the one offering help, not the one owing it. No one had ever asked him for anything this big, and now that I had, he couldn't handle it. Then there was the confrontation. I gathered up the family and asked Darren for the money in front of everyone. I looked around the room for some form of support when I made my statement, but all I got were blank stares. My father gave me a shrug. Darren, on the other hand, just sat there, looking smug, his hands folded in front of him like he had nothing to answer for. The aunt that he paid the credit card for broke the silence and said that I was overreacting and that family isn't just about money. She said I was causing a rift over something trivial, and that we'd all miss each other if one of us had died. She loved pulling the if I were dead card, but this wasn't about that. I needed my money, and she treated it as if it were spare change. I had worked hard to save up that money. I sacrificed nights out with friends, put in overtime shifts at both jobs, and budgeted every meal. And here was my family, acting like it was no big deal that Darren had essentially taken my hard-earned savings and used them to fund his lavish lifestyle. I said that he promised to pay it back, and it's been 6 months with nothing but excuses. Darren leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and told me that the money was tied up. He said the same thing that he'd been telling me for months. As soon as the deal goes through, I'll get it back with interest. He asked me to trust him. I did trust him, but every time I asked for an update, he had another excuse. Meanwhile, he was out here living his best life while I was sitting here wondering if I'd ever see that money again. Before Darren could respond, my uncle, who had been silent up until this point, told me that he was disappointed to see us act like this, and said that Darren was doing something good for the future of the family, and in a couple of years, the $17,000 would mean nothing when we have millions, and that I should be proud that I helped him out early on. I felt my stomach drop. I told him it was fine and left it there. I knew that I was only wasting my time talking to them. I realized that my family wasn't going to help me, so I took matters into my own hands. Over the next few weeks, I stopped going to any family gatherings. Every time I thought about seeing them, my stomach twisted. I started collecting evidence of Darren's spending habits. I knew Darren was spending the money on luxurious things, and while his Instagram posts were public, I needed more. I needed solid proof, so I started digging. I looked into public records, tracked his purchases, and followed up on his so-called business investments. What I found confirmed my suspicions. There was no business. Darren had used my $17,000 to buy a luxury car, take a couple of extravagant vacations, and furnish his new apartment with high-end furniture. The tech startup he had claimed to be investing in didn't even exist. With this information, I decided to consult a financial investigator. It was a tough decision because it meant involving a stranger in family matters, but I didn't see another option. The investigator was able to track Darren's spending even further and provided detailed reports that laid out exactly where my money had gone. As I looked at the final report, I felt a strange mix of relief and anger. Relief that I finally had concrete proof. Anger that I had let it get this far. But now, I had something undeniable. My plan was to present to my family to finally get them to see the truth. When I called for another family meeting, I knew it wouldn't be easy. But I thought, maybe with the evidence in hand, they would finally believe me. I was wrong. Sitting around the same dinner table, I presented everything, including the investigator's report, the public records, and screenshots of Darren's lavish spending. I even had a timeline that outlined how, from the day I loaned him the money, Darren had been using it for personal gain. At first, the room was quiet. I expected shock and maybe some apologies for not believing me sooner. But what I got instead was disbelief. My mom said that couldn't be right and that Darren wouldn't do anything like that. Darren tried to play it off. Some of the money went toward business expenses and he spent some of it on himself, but that's just how business works. He explained. He said he had to look successful to be successful. I confronted him again and told him that he took my money under false pretenses and used it for his own benefit. That's fraud. At the word fraud, the room tensed. My father's face turned red. My uncle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, and my mother just stared at Darren, as if waiting for him to make it all better with some magical explanation. Darren again tried to explain, saying that he needed to invest in himself as well. Even if he got carried away, he said he would pay back every dime, but the damage was done. The evidence was clear. Darren had lied, and now everyone in the room knew it. I thought I had him. He was playing checkers while I was playing chess, but even after everything they heard and had seen, my family continued to side with Darren. They refused to fully hold him accountable. My dad sighed, rubbing his temples. He was clearly frustrated. He wanted me to understand Darren was under pressure and that he was just trying to make something of himself, and mistakes happen, but this wasn't a mistake. Darren didn't accidentally take my money and forget to pay it back. He lied to me, took what I worked hard for, and had no intention of returning it. Then my mom gave me a sad look as if I was the one in the wrong. She didn't side with me. Instead, she hinted that maybe I should have given Darren more time. After all, Darren wouldn't hurt me on purpose. Her words hit harder than I expected. How could they still see him as the victim? I was the one left hanging, but they acted like I was causing the problem. It wasn't about giving him time. It was about trust, and Darren had shattered that. My uncle let out a heavy sigh, and for a second, I thought he might finally understand where I was coming from. But no, he just reminded me that family is more important than money. They didn't want this to tear us apart. I stood up, feeling the weight of it all. I couldn't keep fighting them or keep pretending everything was okay. The next day, I went to my lawyer and filed a lawsuit against Darren for fraud. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one I had left. My family had chosen to protect Darren at my expense, and I wasn't going to let that slide. I had worked too hard for that money to let it slip away without a fight. Once my lawyer served him the papers, I knew that this would lead to my family disowning me. The lawsuit turned the family upside down. Darren, who had been avoiding me for months, suddenly couldn't stop calling. He begged me to drop the case and promised he'd find a way to pay Misread Most, and that betrayal wasn't something I could easily forget. As for Darren, his reputation was in tatters. He is in the works of paying back the money. No one trusted him anymore, so he couldn't pull the rob Paul to pay Peter scheme that he normally conjured up. At least in the end, I got my money for the down payment on my first house, and the interest helped me pay for some new furniture. Back. When that didn't work, he'd lash out, accusing me of ruining his life. But I wasn't buying it. I'd heard his excuses too many times before, and I knew better now. My parents were furious. They didn't care about the money anymore. To them, I was the one destroying the family, but I wasn't backing down. The court proceedings dragged on for months, with Darren's lawyer trying to paint me as unreasonable. During the trial, I was shocked when my uncle took the stand to defend Darren. He was there to testify that the money I had loaned Darren was given in good faith, not a loan at all, but for support. He claimed Darren had made efforts to get other family members to invest in his business too, as if that somehow justified everything. He said that I was one of the many who offered the money since I knew that starting a tech company would need a lot of startup capital. I remember Darren coming to me and asking if I wanted to be part of it, my uncle said, looking directly at the judge. He told me about the business, about how it was going to take off, and he just needed help from family. We all knew he was doing something important for his future. This wasn't a part of some scam. He made it seem like I was one of the many, but none of the others had actually given him money. That part was left out. out. The whole thing was framed as if Darren had been doing the right thing and I had simply misunderstood the situation. But the evidence spoke for itself. They didn't know that I had all the messages between us that showed him saying that he would pay me back. Between this, the investigator's report, Darren's spending records, and his own inconsistent testimony, it all pointed to one thing: fraud. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. Darren was ordered to repay the full amount, plus interest, and was fined for his fraudulent actions. I wish that the court ruling brought some sense of closure, but the truth is, my relationship with my family was forever changed. They apologized, of course, once the ruling came down, but their apologies felt hollow. They had chosen Darren over me when it mattered.